we've got Trump 2.0, we've got, full-scale federal war in the US against DEI. We've had, at the time of recording a few weeks ago, the UK Supreme Court judgment on trans, which effectively has clarified the Equality Act 2010. Is there a feeling that the revolution has run out of momentum from your point of view?
There is that feeling. That doesn't mean that it's true. I certainly have that sense. But of course, we have to wait and see. And I think many of us who've been opposing this woke stuff are quite tired of the process. It's not the most pleasant or enjoyable process. You know that much better than I do. And so we are keen, I think, to see every small ray of light that makes it through as the beginning of the dawn of whatever we imagine it to be. If Donald Trump fails in America, or indeed if he fails by going too far, which is always possible, I imagine that will unleash a wokeness of the kind that we've never seen before. Because the argument will be, well, we told you this guy was X, Y, Z, and look, he actually was. And so I am troubled by all this talk about a third term and all these other things. I think there's a risk of giving a lot of ammunition to those people. And of course, if the economy goes bad, either because of actions or simply because it's the economic cycle, again, that would be I think you'll see a big swing in the opposite direction. So my point is we seem to be in a period when the pendulum is swinging quite rapidly. But I think you're also right. In America, I think it's undoubtedly the case that wokeness was on the ballot to a large extent, and it was defeated to a large extent. I think in the UK, not only the Supreme Court case you mentioned, but we could go down the list. I mean, West Streeting banned puberty blockers on the NHS. This is a Labour health secretary. I don't know if you saw this. I read an article by Tony Blair recently talking about how net zero extremism is a problem. Something you and I think have both been trying to articulate for some time, while being, called all sorts of names and so on. So there are positive changes, but I also look at something like education. I have a young child, and I know from direct personal experiences that books about the possibility of selecting your gender at the age of 3 are still readily available. In fact, still actively being pushed. There are schools who are still catching up to the woke thing, as opposed to catching up to the fact that woke isn't really as big anymore. So how long it takes us to even if we have destroyed the central tumor, how long it takes us to find all the metastatic tumors and get rid of them, that's the best case scenario. That might take some time. Have we broken the back of it? That is my hope.
Is it the case that, at least in cultural terms, we are the 51st state? And as it were, what happens in DC effectively will have ramifications for us that we're still, in effect, if there's a positive change in Washington, then things will get better over here or not. I mean, one might say on the trans issue, Britain has led the way. Some of our feminists, J.K. and celebrities, J.K. Rowling, we think of Kathleen Stock, Julie Bindel, and others.
Maya Forstater,
and so on. There's something that maybe that's not quite true. Maybe we are sort of setting the pace of cultural resistance to some of these woke excesses.
Well, we have become one informational space, which is why the Vice President of the United States, for example, is so frequently talking about free speech problems in the UK, and likewise why so many of us are invited to comment on American issues, which I do very reluctantly, and only because I do actually have the luxury of spending some time there and seeing it with my own eyes. I think it really fundamentally depends on what happens. I think one of the things that all of us have to concede is the Trump administration is doing many of the things it talked about prior to being elected, but it's also doing quite a lot of things that weren't on the ballot box. And those are things that are quite dramatic. The sort of open antipathy towards Europe, for example, is quite off-putting to many people, I think. The territorial expansionist aspirations, likewise. And so I guess what I'm saying is if the correction in America does not become an overcorrection or a correction that goes out of control in some kind of terrible new direction, then I think it will be inevitable that everyone in the rest of the Anglosphere in particular, but the Western world more generally, will say, well, if they can fix their border so can we. If they can fix such and such issue, so can we. If it's proved that, a culture where freedom of speech within the reasonable bounds that we all, I think, would accept is better than a culture of highly restrictive speech, again, you would imagine that there would be an appetite to download that to the UK. If, however, our American friends go too far, I fear that would be very off-putting to a lot of Europeans and may tank the electoral prospects of many centre and centre-right parties in Europe. And the Pierre Poilievre situation is a prime example of what happens when America throws its weight around in a way that puts allies off in that way. So I am very apprehensive in this moment. I think it could go either way.
I mean, it's clear that a lot of the rhetoric coming from Washington towards Europe could be interpreted in that way. I think that's fair. But to what extent do you think, I'm thinking back to the Vice President's speech in Munich that really many European leaders found traumatizing. I mean, the German organizing the Munich Security Conference at the end actually burst into tears as he was closing the conference. It was extraordinary to witness. And I interpreted that speech, and I interpret the heated rhetoric from DC directed at Europe more as being directed at European leaders that I think, the MAGA crowd, those now in the ascendant DC, interpret or believe to be increasingly out of touch with their electorates, increasingly disconnected from the founding values that Americans always thought they shared with Europe and especially shared with Britain. And so I think a lot of the noise is being directed at the technocrats. It's, the thought, somebody put it to me the other day, it's a little bit like, the Americans don't hate Europe. They hate. It's like hating FIFA. You hate FIFA because you love football. It's a bit like the Americans. They can't stand these out of touch European technocrats because they love Europe and they see that Europe and what they love about Europe is being smothered through all of these kind of cultural forces, demographic changes, and so on and so forth. I don't know if that's fair or not.
No, I think that's probably the intention. But I think when you combine it with the sort of sense of, we don't really care about Ukraine, we'll just pull out as quickly as we possibly can. That's been some of the rhetoric. And I'm not saying that that's been the rhetoric from the very top, but you saw the leaked signal messages from the debate about how to strike some targets. But again, there was a lot of the Europeans are doing this. I just think when people talk in those broad brush categories, there's always the risk of the correct criticism of European elites becoming criticisms of Europe more generally, because there are some differences between our cultures. We forget this because we speak the same language, but Americans is different to us and we're different to them. I do take your point. I think it's true. And I'm grateful. I was very grateful that J.D. Vance made that speech in Munich, and even more grateful that he made the speech at the AI summit a couple of weeks or a few days prior.
Which, if it had just been that AI speech in Paris, that itself would have made it the most consequential VP visit in a very long time.
And that was magnificent, because what he fundamentally exposed is that we have become extremely risk-averse as a civilization, and we have got to reset our attitude to risk. And that safetyism thing that Jonathan Haidt and others have talked so much about is something we're just going to have to let go if we want to be the civilization that we have been.